My name is Hunter Pearson. I'm the Executive Director of Teach for America here in the Bay Area. I started as a teacher in Oakland, where I taught middle school English social studies for 2 years at Frick Middle School for you Oaklandites. And I've been the Executive Director of Teach for America here in the Bay Area for the last 3 years. Quick overview on Teach for America, because I don't think I can get it in anywhere else. This year, 17,000 people applied to Teach for America for 2,000 positions nationwide. That's 5% of Stanford's graduating class applied to Teach for America, 8% of Princeton's, Harvard's, 12% of Spelman's, Yale's, Dartmouth's. So a huge amount of folks are applying to Teach for America, and we're glad to bring them in. As an organization, we're growing. In the year 2000, we had about 1,000 core members. That's first and second year teachers. We call them core members, some of them here today. Now, in 2005, we have 3,500 core members at any one time across the country, and in the year 2010 we will have 8,000 core members across the country at any one time. All of that, at the end of the day, we recruit and select, put great teachers in the classroom, but my job is to set the table for the folks sitting next to me right now. Make sure that we bring them the future leaders who will lead their organizations to success, and they in turn ensure that our folks will have an impact on the educational space. Now, social innovation. We all know these stats, and I'm sure all of y'all have freshly studied them too, being in your classes, but it's amazing to think about if you pause and you think that if you make over $90,000 in this country, or if you make over $90,000, you have a 1 out of 2 chance of graduating from a 4-year college. Now, if you make less than $35,000 in your family, you have a 1 out of 17 chance from graduating from a 4-year college. That's pretty stark. I'm sure all of us here know many more examples and stats and statistics. But there is great hope, and that hope comes in the form of the panelists here sitting next to me today and the organizations that they represent. The format of this panel, each panelist is going to introduce themselves, tell you about their organization for about 5 to 10 minutes. Then we have some questions that I am going to pose to them. And then finally, we're going to turn it over to y'all for the last third of the meeting, and y'all will be asking questions and giving them some things to think about and hearing their responses to a couple inquiries that you have and maybe brought here today into the conference. On my immediate right is Marlon Evans. Marlon Evans works with Kipp. Kipp was founded in 1995. It is a network of charter schools. When Kipp was founded in 1995, the first incoming class, only half of them passed the 4th grade test in Texas. The very next year, 90% passed the 5th grade test in Texas, and that was just the beginning of what Kipp has done. Over the years, $21 million in scholarships Kipp students have procured to go to college preparatory schools. There are now 45 Kipp schools, 400 teachers, serving 9,000 students across the nation in 15 states and in the District of Columbia. Marlon himself graduated here from Stanford as an undergrad with a BA in political science and MA in sociology. He ran football and played track. I have the distinguished honor of saying I'm sitting next to someone who signed with a free agent with the Carolina Panthers and the Indianapolis Colts. Pretty cool. He worked in undergraduate admissions here at Stanford and worked to procure major gifts with the Stanford Medical Center, working with individuals who can give over $250,000. So you know who to go to when you need your seed funding for your own organization. Now he is the Director of Operations and works with at Kipp and works with various teams to get them to work together so Kipp can reach its ambitious goals. Sitting next to Marlon is Lynn Liao. She is the director of the Broad Residency. The Broad Residency in Urban Education is a 2-year management training program for talented emerging executives seeking ultimately to lead urban public school districts. There are 45 residents in 16 urban school districts. This year's class of 18 was chosen from 325 highly qualified applicants. I work very closely with some of these folks in Oakland, and they are indeed an impressive bunch. Before that, she was the director of the Broad Foundation. She guided their investments in districts and national principal leadership programs. She worked extensively in New York, San Diego, and Philadelphia. Before that, she worked with SCORE and with McKinsey & Company. She got her MBA and her MA from here at Stanford University. And finally, we have Lena Ved. Lena is also a Stanford graduate. She got her MBA and MA here. She's the Director of Operations for Leadership Public Schools. Her job is to launch 2 to 3 schools each year. Leadership Public School is a high school in San Francisco. 99%, although it serves a very underserved population in San Francisco, 99% of leadership students enroll in college. 96% of their 10th graders pass the California high school exit exam. And for those of you who have taught here in California, you know that is a statistic to be proud of. They have schools in Richmond and East San Jose and are in the process of opening schools in Oakland and in Hayward. Before working at Leadership Public Schools, she worked at SCORE as well. She was a center director managing 5 locations over 3 years, and she also did a little work at the Boys and Girls Clubs here in California. So with that, I'll turn it over to each panelist who will give you a more in-depth introduction both to themselves and their organization.
Thanks, Hunter. I'm always embarrassed when I hear that bio. For one reason, I told Hunter this panel will probably last longer than my career in the NFL. So it's always embarrassing to hear that. But yeah, thank you so much for having Kipp here. Hunter gave a great overview of kind of what we do and what we're trying to accomplish. We did start just as a program in 1994 with 2 Teach for America grads, Mike Feinberg and Dave Levin, who incidentally are in the latest issue of Esquire, Best and Brightest, which is a pretty neat, Bill Clinton's on the cover. It's a pretty neat exposure for the Kipp Foundation. So at your newsstands now, pick that up. And they just were frustrated with the public education system, as we remain to be frustrated by it, and decided to, instead of just passing along their kids to a middle school that wasn't going to provide them with the quality education that they need, to start their own program. So in 1995, Mike Feinberg started Kipp Academy Houston, and Dave Levin went to the Bronx, New York, and started Kipp Academy New York. And 4 years later, because of the great success of both schools, 60 Minutes did a piece on both schools, and Don and Doris Fisher, the co-founders of The Gap, kind of ironic that we're in Fisher 1, decided to see if we could replicate the success of those 2 schools nationwide, and they started the Kipp Foundation in 2000, and that's the organization that I work for. And what we try to do is find more Mike and Daves across the country, give them the training and leadership skills that they need to start and run their own Kipp schools across the country. And like I said, we started in 2000, grew from 2 schools to 45. Our goal is to start about 10 schools each year in low-income communities and provide those students with quality academic options. It's an amazing time to be a part of Kipp, just because of our growth and our ambitious goals. Right now we're serving 9,000 students, and in just 5 years we'll be up to 35,000 kids. And our theory is that, of course, there are millions of students who are in the public education system who we won't be able to touch or serve, and that is something that we feel there's got to be a way, by raising the expectations of those communities and having them be able to point to an institution of excellence that's just down the road serving the same kids, but are seeing dramatically different results. That if we establish enough of those schools in key areas throughout the country, that the districts will start to take notice, the parents will start to take notice, principals, teachers, and they'll take a look at our model and see, well, what is it that these guys are doing that are making them so successful? And what they'll find is that it's not rocket science. We're just working really hard. The schools are in session from 7:30 to 5, Monday through Friday. The students come to Saturday school twice a month. There's summer school for 3 weeks out of the year. So it's just rolling up your sleeves and getting it done, and closing the gap for many of these students who are coming to us and reading at the 3rd grade level or at the 2 grade levels behind where they need to be. And our job is to close the gap so that when they leave, they're prepared for college preparatory, high schools, and universities. What we're doing now is we're primarily a middle school program, with 42 of our schools are at the middle school level. We just launched a pre-K through so an elementary school, and we have two high schools as well. And high schools will be a big area of development for us moving forward, especially in those areas where there are just not enough quality options for our kids to be placed. We can't plant the seed for a dream and say we're going to get you to college from 5th through 8th and then throw them back to a system that's not going to deliver that dream for them. So I could talk probably for the next hour or so, but I'll pass it on.
Thank you. I'm going to start with a quote, and I think it encapsulates some of what Marlon is talking about, the passion that drives Kipp, and I think it also relates very much to the Broad Foundation and Broad Residency's mission. So imagine that upon your arrival at an airline ticket counter, you're told that only 65% of the flights to the intended destination actually even arrive. The remainder crash en route. And if you're a child of color or poor, you're required to fly on a special poorly maintained planes, of which only 35% make it. Sounds crazy, right? But this is exactly the deal that as a nation we are serving up daily to millions of children in thousands of our public schools. This is a quote from Crash Course, which is the book that Chris Whittle, who is the founder of Edison Schools, wrote. And I think that this is the challenge that all of us in these organizations, and probably many of you, are dealing with. Another quote that from our founder, Eli Broad, frequently likes to say to us as well as to others is, "I am not a patient man." And he really means that. So I think when you combine the urgency of this challenge with Eli's energy as well as resources, you get the Broad Foundation, which our organization as a funding institution is to dramatically improve K-12 urban public education through a few main levers. They are better governance, management, labor relations, and competition. What we think we've come to these because we think of them as the systematic underpinnings of the current educational system. And without improving these areas of the system, we're not going to enable individual great schools like a Kipp, like a leadership academy to improve en masse. We're not going to get to the 100% of flights arriving on time. And Eli really came to this conclusion about 7 years ago when he was involved in the superintendent search in LA. And in thinking through, he'd always been involved in philanthropy, primarily in LA, in the arts and other civic areas and higher education, but had not touched K-12 public education. But in the process of thinking through who a great leader would be for this massive institution of LA Unified, he started to think, hey, this is something I might actually, I grasped the significance of this challenge, and I might actually have some insight into thinking about how to build, I have insight about building large institutions. He built 2 Fortune 500 companies, Kaufman and Broad, as well as Sun America. Came from very modest roots where growing up in public schools in Detroit, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, very modest backgrounds, and he very much feels like he's been kind of the classic benefit of the American dream, and just is really dismayed looking out at the future around what we see. So the foundation, how we've interpreted sort of that urgency is in 2 ways. There's sort of 2 cornerstones around our work. One is really thinking about districts as the unit of change, and that 10 years ago, when I think about when I started in education, that wasn't part of the equation. A lot of the work was done at the school level, and there have always been individual examples of amazing schools. But money as well as organizational control flows through districts everywhere around the country. And they just really, so if you think about if you're having a given that we're at the business school, bad retail experience at a Gap, you don't think about solving that, whether that's poor customer service, bad money management, bad inventory, you don't think about solving that at a unit level. You think about what are the interactions between what you would do systematically to reform HR of an organization, compensation and incentives, all of the underlying IT structures. And so again, it seemed like we were sort of looking at the symptoms at a school level, but not thinking about how institutionally districts would need to change. So that's really become a core focus of the Broad Foundation. So really, we've made a lot of investments around district management systems, both reforming how districts are structured pretty dramatically. So our major investments, biggest investments there have been in Oakland and New York, and also in areas of district performance. So principal leadership has been a huge area that I've worked a lot in. We've also started to work more explicitly around reforming HR, so that very critical things like making sure all teachers get paid on time actually happen, as well as kind of broader goals around retention and really employee satisfaction over time and growth. The other kind of core belief in the foundation and of Eli's is that no matter what good ideas exist in education, they're not going to happen unless you have leaders with the passion and conviction and management skills to get it to happen. So these could be leaders within governance, so within the school board, within the management levels of superintendents or the residency or principals, within labor, which has been a challenge for us over the last 6 years, and also good pushes from outside. So we need to make sure that amazing charter organizations like these are also have continued leadership capacity to grow and thrive. So districts and leadership are kind of the thing, headlines around the Broad Foundation. The way we act is we fund. I guess a way to describe it is sort of like a VC model, but also as an active consultant and partner, strategic advisor. More concretely, the initiatives that we end up investing in happen in two ways. One is we incubate them ourselves. So it's kind of an idea that through our own work and investigation around the market, seems like its time has come. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the second is as a grantor, which is a little bit more in the traditional way of giving. So an example of an incubation project is the Broad Residency, which is the program I'm now working on. So in literally November of 2003, we had been talking around the table about how we had so many colleagues and friends who were interested in jumping into public education, had great business expertise, but didn't know where they fit. They kind of didn't want to start as a teacher because they thought a lot of their skills wouldn't be as applicable there. But they didn't really know if they could jump in as like a COO of a charter organization. Like they just didn't have the operations down at that level of detail. There just weren't that many opportunities available. On the other hand, we were running into districts all the time where there was great leadership, but not people who could actually carry out their main change initiatives. So it just seemed like a program like the Broad Residency that was designed to match this talent with the need would be a great solution. So we wrote a sort of internal business plan, got it funded, and by February of that year, we're recruiting. So I think that's actually a great example for us of having the power of the resources in-house as well as being connected with the market enough that we were able to jump on an opportunity and make it happen. So in terms of granting, we grant mainly to urban districts around the country. So there's criteria around size, percent poverty. There's essentially our market is about 100 large urban school districts. We've funded actively and closer to about 30, but we touch them in many more ways around our leadership programs, whether that's the superintendent's program or the Broad Residency. I think I'm going to leave it at that, and then we can take more with questions.
Thanks, Lynn. One of the things I'm really struck by is that we're talking about the stories of the founders of our organizations, and then here they've created opportunities for a new level of leadership. Lynn is a few years ahead of me from the business school, and I remember calling you for an informational interview when I first graduated, and it's just really amazing to be in an environment like this and have a chance to dialogue with all of you who are here. So what I would like to do is just get a quick sense of actually who's in the room. How many of you guys have had any experience working in the education industry? Public school, private school, a lot. Okay, are any of you guys currently working in the industry? You're not students right now? Great, so a couple of industry people. How many of you guys are second years in the second year of your MBA program and you're looking for full-time opportunities after you graduate in education? Okay, so a couple. And how many of you guys are first years, possibly interested in summer internship opportunities? Wow, lots of first years. Okay, great. Thank you. That kind of helps me figure out who we're talking to. I was hoping I'll tell you just a little bit about leadership, and situated in the space of other charter management organizations, and then in the charter world, and then also just maybe talk just a little bit about my personal path getting here and kind of following the path of other leaders before me. So Leadership Public Schools is also a network of small public charter schools. They're all high schools. So Hunter gave you a sense in the introduction of the first leadership school. It was called Leadership High School. It was in San Francisco. The organization I work for is a spin-off. It's a separate organization where our founder, Mark Kushner, said, I can do this in one school, but I need a separate organization to be able to replicate this model to serve even more kids all throughout urban places in California. And the people of that school at the time were more interested in making sure they could serve the kids they had very deeply in that community very well. So they're now two separate organizations. So what we do when I say small schools, 500 kids or less. That's a big difference from a typical comprehensive high school. Our model in the country right now is lots and lots of different classes with 3,000 or so high school kids in one building or one school. And it serves the needs of some kids very well, but there are certain subgroups of kids who often are not served at all. Often students of color, students that are economically disadvantaged. This isn't a model that's necessarily serving the kids in our country, all of them. Public schools, meaning we're getting state and federal money to run these schools. It's about $7,000 a kid. One of the specific challenges in California is we're talking about very little money. I mean, this is about half the amount of money you would have to educate a student, let's say, in Boston. Charter, what that means, I think a lot of you might be familiar with charters, but a charter basically is an organization a charter school is a school run by someone besides your traditional public school district, and to have the right to run a school freed of some of the constraints of the education code, which is like 15 binders, like this big. The ed code's crazy. You're responsible to achieve certain measures of accountability, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. So some of the ways you have Kipp here and you have leadership here, lots of similarities among charter management organizations, but the environment is what also created the need for organizations to cluster for economic efficiencies. For starting schools is incredibly hard work. So it helps, a charter management organization helps bring some of the expertise in some of the areas so a principal doesn't have to do everything. So one of the tenets of our organization is we think it helps to have a pretty, we call it like a tight design. It's something that we picked up from Don Shalvey at Aspire, where if I was going to just draw on the air a little 2x2 consultancy matrix, here's this matrix is how tight you are on education control of the educational program. And this one is how tight you are on control of business functions. So leadership, I'd put kind of in this category where we're saying, wow, schools are tough. High schools are even more tough. What we'll do is we want to have pretty tight control over the educational quality, so we're all one organization. And also pretty tight control over operational skills, because that's often what's tripping up charter school leaders. So we have a home office with a bunch of experts who can do some of the tough pieces. So recruiting teachers, which is a huge challenge. We really need places like TFA, nonprofits like RISE, Resources Independent for schools, to help solve that problem. So HR, facilities, that's another major challenge for charter schools. It's pretty hard to get a building. Accounting, payroll, help get the charter in the first place. It's a lot to ask a principal to go out there and go get their own charter. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do as a charter management organization, is to help support the principal with that. Another piece of our organizational design is financial sustainability. So even though it's very little public money, we're saying we can run our schools with just the money we get from the state when we're at full scale. We need some money when we start, because when we first start the schools, there's only 9th grade and then 10th grade and 11th every year thereafter. But so we need about $1.5 million to start the schools in the first place. But after that, if funding dries up and things are lean, the doors can stay open. And we're still going to need to always fundraise. $7,000 is very, very little money. You need to always have more money for enrichment and for some other areas. But at least the school doesn't have to shut down. And we've been able to achieve that business model so far. And I just also to give you a sense of charters, and I think we'll talk more about it as well through questions, but charters are now about 3% of the kids in California. So it's a pretty robust movement in this state. So California is sort of leading some of the vanguard in the leading the efforts in the country towards the charter movement. Charter started in 91 in Minnesota, 92 in California. So this state's starting to hit its second round of charters. I'd say we've done a proliferation of mom and pop charter schools, which are amazing, and they really serve those communities really well. But again, it's very hard to replicate that. They often rely on these amazing people who work unbelievable hours, and they're killing themselves to run these schools, right? It's not necessarily a sustainable model. I have a lot of respect for people who can do that. I think the stage we're on now is, as a state, is kind of thinking about how can we replicate more, and then a little bit of a school of tough love. So Mark Kushner's on the California State he chairs the advisory panel to the state on charter schools. And his opinion is if a charter school isn't doing well, we should shut it down. Because we don't need lots of charter schools, we need lots of high quality schools. If we don't need to have charters because all of the traditional district schools are high quality, that's great. But it's not about small schools, it's not about charter schools, it's about making as many high quality schools so we can address the challenge that Lynn was talking about with the airplane example. If I kind of take it down a level and talk about how I came to leadership. So again, it was I think 3 or 4 years ago that I was at the GSB talking to people like Lynn, trying to figure out what to do next. And I got advice from someone named Rick Aubrey. He runs Rubicon Bakery. I don't know if some of you guys know that name. He was a visiting professor here, and he said, think about when you graduate from school, doing something that's somewhat operational. Because he was saying, well, if what I could do is kind of learn the intricacies of some of the way a particular field works before I think about the more strategic elements of it, which I thought was really good advice. So what I was looking for in my first few jobs out of the GSB was really good opportunities to work on operational details. I was looking for really good mentorship because I think the first couple of jobs out, you're still learning at a pretty fast pace, and I love the people I work with. They're just really just smart, incredible people. Our COO is my direct boss, and he's a Broad resident now. So these are very connected organizations. Lynn runs his program. I was looking for a place that was tackling tough challenges. So I had been doing after-school work before this, and I felt like I wish I was in a place where we had even more time to work on the critical issues that kids face. And high school seemed really hard. You only have 4 more years for these kids to go to college. And for example, at leadership, 43% of our kids who come in they have math and reading skills between the 2nd and 7th grade level. So that means most of our kids need to do 6 academic years of work or more in the period of 4 years, which is pretty challenging to do that. It takes a lot of extra time. I think very much like how Kipp thinks that there are no shortcuts. And we very much think there's a lot of time on task to achieve some of the results that these kids need to achieve to be able to get to college. So I found that I found some of those attributes of what I was looking for: mentorship, tough challenges, operational involvement at leadership. And so I suggest so for some of you guys who are students, as you're looking for your next roles, think about the things that really matter to you and look for organizations that might have that. In a very shameless way, I want to make a plug that we actually have several jobs that are open. We'll have 3 summer internships for first-year students, MBA summer internships to be involved in operations, and then we have about 3 or 4 jobs that are open now that are appropriate for people who are looking for full-time positions. So they're on, I think several of us have handouts that have gone around the room, so they're on that. Great. I think I'll stop there.
Systemic change, and Lena, I'd love to actually pose this question to you, and then I'd love Lynn and Marlon if y'all could comment on it. Lynn, you can think in terms of districts or departments if you're focused on a certain department. Systemic change, how do you facilitate change in the public education system as a whole, beyond your network of schools or leaders? And if your answer is we provide a model, tell me how that model is being seized or taken by the community. Actually, Lena, why don't we start and then we'll go. We'll start with Lynn and go.
Because Lynn's answer is going to be really interesting. Okay. I would think leadership sort of thinks of the systemic change impact in terms of different audiences. So I'd say there's 3 different places we're trying to make major impact. The first is district impact. The second is with our charter peers, where we're very cooperative. And the third is with a national audience of lobbyists and policymakers. So in terms of a district impact, part of our mission statement is to partner with local school districts. Now, the reality of it is it's not that easy. The first year or 2, when we open a charter school, we're taking buildings and a little bit of funding away from the local traditional school district. They're not super happy about that. But usually what happens is if we're doing well as a school and we're educating the kids well, about a year or 2 into it, we start to develop pretty good relationships with that traditional school district, and they'll really work with us. I think our model right now is in Oakland. We're an internal charter for Oakland Unified School District. So we're running a charter school on a campus where Oakland Unified has 3 other small schools. So we can learn from each other. We're leading some professional development initiatives for all of the principals. And there's a little bit of a sort of a little bit of competition where our principal there wants to show that he can do an amazing job and, is trying to kind of set that example there. Another piece on this district impact is we're trying to share best practices back and forth. Now, I don't think we're necessarily at the most receptive stage for that, but we just had a symposium on district charter relations. It was the first that we knew of in the area, and we were talking about how could traditional school districts and people like leadership or Kipp partner with them, partner together to address tough challenges like lobbying for more educational funding or some of the things that if we worked together instead of against each other, we would get somewhere. And then on the other 2 pieces, very, very briefly, we're very cooperative with other charter school networks. So Kipp, Aspire, Leadership, Green Dot, very similar organizations, and ideas are flying back and forth all the time. We benefit a lot from the other organizations. And the last piece is with this national audience, I think, Mark playing a role on the Charter Commission is sort of changing the tone of how we're talking about charters in the state. You'll see the same thing with other organizations like Aspire. Don Shalvey sitting on the chair of the Special Education Committee because he's trying to change special education for all kids in the state, even though he runs a charter nonprofit. So with that national audience, there's some opportunities like disseminating grants from the state. There's leadership training that we're trying to provide. So a couple of things like that. So those 3 audiences. Thanks.
Okay, so systemic change. I'll start with a couple, the most specific grant investments that we think are having a systemic change beyond our individual district grants or national programs. The first is the Bird Prize, which some of you may have heard of. And so for the last now 4 years, we've been awarding the district that has made the greatest gains in student performance and in closing the achievement gap with an award of $500,000. Not that much money, yeah. $500,000 plus a group of finalists. So there's actually, it's called a $1 million prize because each of the finalists also get $125,000, and the money goes towards student scholarships. Actually, very much with the same philosophy for the students who have shown the greatest improvement within their high school period. So it's like not to the students who would probably otherwise be going to college or getting scholarships. It's for that group that's been improving the most. And I think what we started this prize because we really wanted to make a statement. This goes back to kind of that core issue of districts. That districts, there's reason for hope. I mean, despite all of the terrible statistics, there really are districts that are moving in the right direction, and some of those practices are known. So going to Hunter, your point on what are those practices, a lot of them are around instructional management. So it's essentially setting out a system where there's clearly defined standards for student performance, and in the better cases, for in the districts that really have been making it into the finalist list consistently, there are standards around teacher practice. So being able to define, what does a teacher need to do to be able to help students reach that bar? And then regular assessments to help them get there. And then beyond that, it's an aligned system of teacher training and recruitment, principal training and recruitment, overall people management, as well as school level management that's all aligned towards that goal. And we've seen this really consistently. So again, the prize process starts with the data. So we don't try to come up with districts that are using common practices. We just look back at the data available for the top 100 school districts and see which ones emerge. What we found is that the practices that they end up having are quite common in terms of instructional management. So in terms of spreading beyond the message beyond these districts, for the first time this year we had a symposium where we were sharing these practices as well as documenting it. It's starting to get some traction in terms of press. So, for example, there was a great series of articles in D.C., also in Chicago, where they were highlighting this year's winner, Norfolk, And it's essentially starting to change the debate to say, in the way we had hoped initially, to say, why can't Chicago or why can't DC make the gains that are happening in Norfolk, Virginia, or in the 4 other places? So it's not just happening in one place. Now we have an accumulated set of districts that are making this kind of progress. So the Broad Prize is one. The second investment that's major and is a partnership between the Broad Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the Department of Education is essentially a website, but it's a tool for better data transparency and accountability. It's a tool developed by Standard & Poor's, and again, for those of you in business school, kind of know the value of good financial data and the power of being able to compare performance across companies and to compare it in a common way. And that just really didn't exist in school systems because every state has a different system, and they still do. But what we funded S&P to do is really go through a very detailed process of culling the data in all the states that have been cooperating with us to clean it and report it back in a common way. So something as straightforward as how many teachers there are, let alone how many teachers per classroom, you just really couldn't count in a common way. But what S&P is now doing through this website called schoolmatters.com, you can now go up there and look at both the core statistics around achievement as well as what inputs go into it. And very interesting as well as very provocative, the piece that was really critical for us was to start playing at some ROI statistics. And we don't claim, and S&P doesn't claim, that this is like the be-all, end-all, but it starts getting at the notion to say, how should we mutually be holding our systems accountable for what results, how much they're putting in and what ways they're using the resources and what kind of results are coming out the other end. We hope that over time that this tool and this data transparency will help start changing the debate among policymakers, parents, and local district managers. We're still early days on that. The last way that is very early stage for the foundation is really having a policy agenda. So we've had a policy director now for the last 2 years, but it's literally just like one person, and he's had his hands pretty full with local policy, state level policy issues. We really hope that over time, as we collect more expertise around what kind of policies need to be changed at the district level, that we'll start building that into state level policy change as well as federal level policy change. So currently we think of our investments in leadership in districts as optimizing around the current set of rules. The policy work is going to be changing the rules for everyone, and we think that over the next 5 to 10 years for the foundation, that's going to become an increasingly prominent way in which you kind of hear the Broad Foundation engage, but also where we're going to have really broad scale impact that goes far beyond the individual leaders we're funding.
Yeah, I would just add, as far as Kipp, I think the way we're looking at systemic reform is quite simple. It's competition. We feel that by establishing these high-performing schools in low-income areas that are not performing in the way that they need to, if we can cluster. When we first started Kipp, it was kind of we'd find any leader who wanted to open a school and we felt met our requirements, and they wanted to open it in Gaston, North Carolina, in the middle of a peanut field. We'd say, go for it. And we're glad that we did, because that school is now one of the best schools in all of North Carolina. But as we've grown, we've become more concentrated in thinking about, well, how can we get to that tipping point, and how can we have the kind of impact that we want nationwide by clustering schools in given locales. So now we're focusing a lot of our growth in New York, Washington, D.C., Houston, Chicago, Philadelphia, areas where we feel like we can make a really significant impact by educating 5 to maybe 10% of the students in those areas. And if we're showing that we can deliver for those students and get them on the path to college and earn acceptances, that the districts will have to step up their game, which is all that we want. What's going on right now, and I'll preach for a little bit, is just it's just unacceptable. And I think that's why I've joined Kipp. That's why Mark Medina and Beth and Allison, who also are in the audience, have been a part of Kipp, is because what the districts are doing, and Lynn being in the heart of it right now, we need more folks like her who are who are championing the right thing in this bureaucracy, but we need this outside influence, and all of you guys being NBAs, I mean, competition is really what's going to drive it, and we can really impact and hit them where it really counts, which is taking resources from them, and that's not the Kipp party line, that's my party line, but I think that's one of the ways that we can get to where we need to be.
The union question, and Lynn, I'd like to pose this to you. Do union contracts hinder your organization's ability to affect student achievement, or do they enhance the school environment? Lynn, you want to start us off? Because you mentioned something about, I was thinking who was on opposed to, and you said labor. I was like, ooh.
So, not to be put on the spot or anything, I guess, if faced with those two choices, hinder versus enhance, I would probably say hinder, but I don't think the union contract is amazing gains in student achievement can be made within the context of the current union contract. It's hard, but people can do it. That said, everyone within school systems work would probably feel feel better rewarded with their work if labor relations went more smoothly. In the first 2 years I was at the foundation, I worked specifically on a grant with the Teacher Union Reform Network with some of their more innovative union district partnerships to help focus those labor contracts in 4 cities, San Francisco, Toledo, Rochester, and Montgomery County, Maryland, on student achievement. So it was trying to take the traditional labor contract and see how could they reframe aspects of it to focus on the most important things. And there was some progress in that, but through, I guess, my major personal learning through that was there's real challenges on both sides. And so part of the, I think it can be tempting to say that the union contract is a barrier, but I think it ends up actually being, that belief ends up being a bigger hindrance to progress, because it frankly, it puts a lot on, there's this union leader who loves to use this phrase, but I think he's kind of right. Management gets the unions that they deserve. And it may not be that superintendent who's currently in place who deserves the union that's there, but there's a long history of, from who the teachers and principals all remember of how management has behaved over the previous 30 or 40 years that has helped that current union leadership get elected. And so without changing that dynamic, I think it's hard to imagine progress. One piece of the equation we think is going to be investing in union leadership in the same ways we have in district level management. Secondly, we've also realized that a way to address that larger context around the labor relationship is to realize that really a different way to describe labor relations is just people management. It's kind of the core of what I think a lot of us pulled out of business school, is that it's really critical how you design your organizations and develop your people. And so the better entry point into those issues has been for us through HR. So we have now been investing in New York for the last year and a half on a strategic redesign of their HR system. So from day one, if management treats all of their employees with great respect, and every day, not just through the hiring process, it really starts changing the need for a union. And we think so in very concrete ways, they're trying to redesign both the outreach processes as well as career development, resources for all employees that we think is then going to get us into, and the union is appreciative of it. They actually think that that's a great thing too. So essentially, if union and management start having areas that they can work successfully on, we think that's going to help them take the next step to work on tougher issues like teacher placement and equity of teacher placement, how compensation systems should work, and that's starting to get directly addressed through the HR work that we're starting to do with districts.
Ron and Leah, do either of you all have about 30 seconds to 1 minute?
Sure. Briefly, leadership has it easy, right? We're a new organization, pretty young. We have 4 schools now, so our position on unions is pretty neutral, right? Right now, our teachers haven't asked to put together a union. I think one of the things we were trying to do proactively, again, you can do this when you have a fresh slate, is we created a teacher compensation system in conjunction with our existing teachers that kind of puts into place some of the practices that we're hearing are best practices or from research that makes sense. So there's research tells us that teachers who are often in their 4th through 8th year of teaching are often the most effective teachers. So our compensation plan will give the most weight to that. And then beyond that, it's not so much for years of teaching you get compensated for, but for the skills that you bring. And often these teachers who are more experienced have demonstrated the ability to master teach and teach things to other teachers, which is worth paying for as well. So we've been talking with some union leaders, and the charter movement altogether, if you think about it, about 1/3 of charter schools are union schools. Some of them, like Green Dot Public Schools, they have their own internal union. So I don't think that unions are necessarily something that stops good schools from becoming better, but I think that what the arguments are typically about are things, as Lynn was talking about, HR practices that if they were done well in the first place wouldn't have such contentious relationships.
I've said too much already. I'll get in trouble if I start talking about you.
All right. You're on tape. Well, fair enough. Then we'll start with you at the next one then, Marlon. Sure. Sustainability question. So Kipp obviously attracts outstanding leaders, really dynamic and detail-oriented folks. How do you ensure the sustainability of your schools after that leader transitions in the long haul?
So that's where really the Kipp Foundation comes into play. I mean, our role is to make, as Lena said, make the job a little bit easier, which is very challenging as is. So we offer support services in the form of professional development for the teachers, for the school leaders. We try to take some of the things off of their plate in terms of helping them with some of their facilities, recruitment, whatever it might be, some of the core things that they're trying to accomplish. But at the end of the day, for this to be a replicable, sustainable model, these schools need to be able to function on their own without the Kipp Foundation's support. So if Kipp were to go away tomorrow, hopefully our 45 schools would still be long-standing institutions of excellence. But whatever we can do to help to support them through that time, we're going to try to do it.
Both of y'all are obviously dependent on the residents or your school leaders as well. Very briefly, how do y'all think about sustainability? And in general, how do you construct an organization that's dependent on very strong leaders so that it is sustainable in the long run? Lena, do you want to go?
I'll say a little bit. I think one of the things we're trying to do is move from a model where you have to have this amazing, heroic leader and have something where it's very similar to something I learned here at business school called high performance leadership, where I don't know if any of you guys have taken that class, but it's about how can you have an organization that has a culture that celebrates leadership by having people hold each other mutually accountable. So some of the things I see are a very strong culture at leadership, very strong processes where we're holding each other accountable. And to hit the sustainability question, I think there's basically 3 things that we're trying to do. One is strong expertise in the home office. I already talked about that, and it's the same point Marlon was just making. The second one was financial sustainability, which again I mentioned earlier that we can run on just the hard money we get from the state. And the third thing, for us to stay in business, we have to educate the kids well. Otherwise, we lose the right to educate them and we shut our doors, right? So for that, part of our sustainability issue is we have a very strong focus on instruction and on professional development. So for teachers, more professional development days than some other places, so 15 professional development days. There are things that we know work well, that some teachers know how to do well, that we're trying to teach everybody. Because when we talk about sustainability, it's not just about a school leader, about an individual principal leaving. We're talking about incredibly high teacher turnover. So most new schools have 50% turnover or more of teachers. It's very common, a 50 to 75% turnover. Pretty tough to run a sustainable school when the teachers keep changing. So we're trying to teach our teachers things like, this is how you run a class with differentiated instruction. This is how you teach a class where you can teach to the top 25% of the students in the class and give extra support to everyone else instead of teaching to the middle of the class. So a couple of practices like that. I think one of the big initiatives right now is standards-based report cards. So how can we teach teachers to grade in a different way? Where are the kids learning how to do a particular standard, not can you take all their grades and average their work of effort and academic factors and non-academic factors. So we're trying to take some of the research and teach the whole organization so it doesn't live in just one or two people, school leaders or one or two teachers.
In 5 minutes, we're going to open up to questions. We have about 35 minutes remaining, so if you could get your questions ready. You can either pose them to an individual panelist or just the group in general, and it'll be kind of a free-for-all and see who jumps on it. Accountability. To close, before we turn to audience questions, I would love for each person just to speak for about a minute and a half about how your organization measures success and how do you ensure quality across all parts of your network. Not to pick someone to start, whoever's just feeling it can jump right in.
Tracking during the lifetime of the grant. Within the grant term, it has more specifics. How often it's going to be tracked, where's the source of the data, and I'm not talking something more at the dashboard level, 2 pages, so maybe 10 things that are kind of the important things that we want to track. It really varies by type of grant. For grants that we've been doing a lot of, like principal training, the area I was working in, we started very much to start standardizing what some of those metrics are. Then that implies, and during the life cycle of the grant, through regular progress reports as well as formal evaluation reports, we'd be tracking the results. So definitely for the grant programs where we felt like where there is a greater connection to student achievement. So our leadership programs for superintendents, for principals, and our charter investments. We do very detailed analysis of the student achievement results, comparing across a number of comparison groups. So we essentially look at the performance of sort of our group, whether that's the group of charter schools or the principals we've trained, against the district average and against comparable schools. And what comparable means is a little different in each case. We look at it for average proficiency levels, improvement of the lowest performing group, and then by subgroups. For grants that are more kind of what we call have intermediate impact, like HR process redesign, the metrics become very specific to that grant. So that would be, for that grant in particular, there's metrics around teacher hiring, retention, et cetera, that we, again, come up with the grantee up front. Did I get it?
I think the heart of the matter is academic accountability. So there are 3 things that we commit to when we open a leadership school. Now, we haven't graduated a class yet of our 4 LPS schools, but what we're looking to do is have, by the 4th year of a school's operation, 100% of the students matriculate to college. We're looking for our school to perform as well as 80%, to score an 8 on the similar schools ranking. That means if you take our school and you compare it to schools that are similar, that we're doing as well as 80%, at least the 80% mark. And the third thing is that we have a dropout rate that's half of the traditional school district. So that's just the academic piece. I think one way we also think about measuring success is we've a process where one piece is something we call objectives and key results. We learned it from Google. We have a great board with some for-profit people who are on it. And they taught us to make one system of organization-wide objectives we're trying to hit. And the board, the senior management, all the schools are all trying to achieve the same thing. So for us this year, it's things like building a very strong home office culture, nailing our mission and making sure we're opening schools, for example, in the lowest performing communities. And then the OKRs tells you where you want to go. And then we have another piece that's similar to what Lynn was talking about with the dashboard. We have something that looks like this. So it's like 2 pages long for any individual school. And the dashboard tells you how that school is doing at that moment in time. So there's an academic dashboard. You can talk about leadership at the school. There's operational pieces. Are we on budget? Are the kids showing up? You know, how are we doing on recruiting teachers that have credentials, things like that. Pieces on school vitality. Are we running schools that are creating enough clubs and enough opportunities for students to lead? So I don't think anyone has the exact perfect answer, but there's a lot of different things to look at to figure out if a school is successful. But ultimately, it comes down to the academic performance.
No, I would just echo those same sentiments. We kind of divide it up between how we're measuring how well the foundation is doing, how well our schools are doing. Very similar. We are all about student performance and increasing student achievement. We have some internal measures at the foundation where we're looking at, well, how well are we delivering training? How well, our schools, are we establishing sustainable schools? In addition, how are we looking internally in terms of our culture and the type of employees we're bringing onto the foundation. So those are kind of our internal metrics. But at the end of the day, we measure ourselves against how well our students are doing, and are they putting their students on the path to college, and how well are they performing in some of the standardized and national tests.